Welcome to the Aerospace Executive Podcast, featuring in-depth conversations with executives, leaders, influencers, and journalists in this dynamic, high-stakes industry. Hosted by Craig Picken, founder of North Star Group, the boutique executive search firm for the aerospace industry. You'll learn how top aerospace executives are developing their people, competing for talent, overcoming challenges, and adjusting to industry trends to drive growth and profits. And now, let's join your host, Craig Picken.
You're listening to the Aerospace Executive Podcast. I'm Craig Picken. Hey, you can find more of these episodes on iTunes or Podbean, or just Google the Aerospace Executive Podcast, and we'll show up. Our mission here is to have it's pretty simple, just to have relevant conversations with industry and business leaders on a variety of topics. We try to be both informative and entertaining. If you have some questions, comments, suggestions for a new show, please reach out to me at 910-509-7129 or email me at craig@northstaresg.com. Pretty soon you'll also be able to download these off my new website, which is www.northstaresg.com. That's currently being redone and should be launched here in the next 30 days. So looking forward to that. Hey, we try to keep these things at about 30 minutes, but this episode today is with John Alvarez, and it goes about an hour. And the reason it goes about an hour is because John's story is just absolutely fascinating. You'll find it to be amazing in a lot of different ways. John is a fellow I first met in probably October, November 1987. We were both boot ensigns together in Corpus Christi, Texas. He was going through primary flight training. I was kind of passing through Corpus Christi, and we became friends. John is also let's go back. John is also a member of the Air Commando Hall of Fame, and he's also the very first aviator in U.S. history to be restored to full combat flying status after he lost his leg while flying combat. I think what you'll find really interesting about the story is not just John's perseverance, but people in the nation who stepped up to help him in his quest. John, how are you?
Good afternoon.
So we'll go back. You and I met, almost about 32 years ago now? 1980?
Yeah, 88, 87, 88, 89. Yeah, because we got commissioned in 87.
Boot ensigns
and then
together.
Flight school.
Yeah, we're boot ensigns together in Corpus Christi, Texas.
Correct. That's right. Long time ago.
I'm still holding a grudge for when you stole my table and tried to pass the broken one off as yours. We'll get into that another day. So
alrighty.
So all good. So you and I both we're both naval aviators. We took some different paths, but you got a pretty interesting story. So ultimately, you left Corpus Christi, primary flight in Corpus Christi, went over to Pensacola, and flew helicopters.
Correct. Yeah, transitioned to helicopters, was winged in 89, chose H-53s. Knew I wasn't going to go carrier aviation at that point, so I wanted the biggest, baddest helicopter the Navy could muster. My on-wing was a Marine H-53 driver, and so was my fixed-wing on-wing was a Navy H-53 driver. And at one of those fly-ins, I got to fly in a 53. And I was like, man, this is what, was one of the newest aircraft in the fleet at the time for the Navy. Actually got to pick one up as a co-pilot out of South Florida and fly it all the way back to Alameda when I was first flying, my first flying station there, Naval Air Station, Alameda.
Holy cow. So Florida to California in an H-53.
Yep. Yeah, that was quite a trip. Being just right out of flight school, new in the unit, a humongous aircraft. Actually, and at that time too, one of the fastest helicopters in the fleet.
How long did that trip take?
It took us 4 days, but again, we stopped in Corpus Christi. My the aircraft commander wanted to stop in Corpus, so we actually spent a day there. Again, this helicopter back then, over the years, max speed was reduced, but I think, we were averaging 150 plus knots ground speed the whole way. So for a helicopter, it could move, in fact, at one point we had like 220 knots ground speed when we were in California going north from LA.
Holy cow.
So we had some winds behind us. We were way up at altitude and had the winds behind us too. So
yeah, I see the I live right here in Wilmington, North Carolina, and I see the 53s from New River flying over the beach. And no matter how many times you see them, it's still a pretty amazing helicopter. But all good. So you went and flew 53s. You were 11 years in the Navy doing that, and then you transitioned over to the Air Force, correct?
All right. Yeah. So I guess after my first assignment in Alameda, I was extended a little bit after the first Gulf War, and then went to Naval Postgraduate School to study aeronautical engineering. I thought at one point too had opportunity to go to the space program or apply for test pilot school. And while I was there was an exchange program being started between the Navy and Special Ops Command. There was already a Marine exchange pilot working with the Air Force, and then another one working with the Army Special Ops. They were setting one up with the Navy, so it was going to be a 53 driver and an 860 driver. The 60 driver ended up going to the rescue forces, and I was selected for the program. I had to pull my application to test pilot school, and under encouragement from leadership, I was selected for this. So this was back in 94. 95, I went out to Kirtland Air Force Base to get transition training in the MH-53J, which was the Air Force payload special ops insertion extraction platform back then. And so I was actually like a shipboard and shipboard instructor on that side of the fence for a bit at the schoolhouse while I was learning how to fly the 53 for the Air Force. And actually was really learning more of the mission and how they accomplished the mission. And then got to my line unit at Hurlburt Field right outside of Eglin Air Force Base in December of 95.
Okay. So basically, you 11 years in the Air Force, Navy postgraduate school, and then you did a transition tour to Air Force Special Ops, flying the payloads.
Yep. So 11 years in the Navy. Out of those last 3.5, I was assigned to Air Force unit. A lot of stuff happened in that 3.5, 4-year period. I was offered an inter-service transfer. This is about the time I was selected to lieutenant commander in the Navy. The Air Force was short helicopter pilots, and on top of that, they were short special ops pilots. I guess they just weren't getting enough people to volunteer. And I was already an aircraft commander, flight lead, instructor pilot, and it worked out. I mean, but there was a lot of stuff that happened between me getting there as a Navy pilot and then me transitioning.
Right. So once you made the transition, tell us about the life of a Navy/Air Force Special Operations pilot.
So interesting enough, through that period, as the Navy guy in an Air Force unit, Navy Special Warfare Command took an interest in it. Navy Special Warfare Development Group, in particular, Dev Group, was very interested. So because we were supporting them and both the East Coast and the West Coast SEALs, along with Special Forces and Army Rangers, were primarily the customers. And so, there was like a lot of, hey, you're a Navy guy in there. Why isn't the Navy doing this? The Navy did have a dedicated special ops helicopter unit in Vietnam, actually had 2. And then later they were put in the reserves, and there was a fight back and forth on whether they were going to continue and whether SOCOM was going to accept them as support units for in the Joint Special Ops world. And interesting enough, then later the HCS squadrons in Iraq after 9/11 played a big role. in supporting special ops. But at the end of the day, the naval aviation absorbed that into the larger units, that mission set into larger units.
So you were flying, were you, the whole time you were there, were you flying 53s or were you?
No, I was primarily there, to the beginning as a payload pilot, flying MH-53s. During that time, I was there early on. I was recruited into another unit, the 6th Special Ops Squadron, which are combat aviation advisors. So they're equivalent to special forces, but for aviation. So you go out, train, advise, and assist other countries with air power. And I was previously, that was a classified detachment inside of AFSOC. It became a squadron. I was attached to them for their Latin America operations. And there, I got qualified in the Puma, which is now an HH-225. The Gazelle gunship. Later, I flew Mi-17s, Russian aircraft, became an expert in the Mi-17 series. Actually got some fixed wing time in the Antonov 32, C-47 of all things, a Basler conversion, turboprop C-47, and Casa 212s, but primarily helicopters. And I spent a good part of my Air Force career in that unit. I spent 3 assignments in there and commanded it later. So that was probably my really, most interesting part of my Air Force career. So again, I transitioned at the 11-year point, pinned on 04. The Air Force recruiter or the Air Force assignments guy said, "Hey, pin on in the Navy. That way we figure out what your data rank is, and we don't have to try to calculate it. You have your data rank." And I was already in Air Force unit. I, stationed in Northwest Florida. Drove over to Pensacola, signed all my paperwork to basically sign out of the Navy. Got my DD-2, 214 from the Navy, and then that afternoon came back to Hurlburt Field, got sworn in into the Air Force, became an Air Force officer overnight while I was still trying to figure out how to put my Air Force uniform together. Lady at the exchange actually put my uniform together for me. The sales lady at the uniform shop taught me that, and one of the only requirements was my squadron commander said, "You're going to sing the Air Force song in front of the squadron by yourself with no background music, and you better know all the verses and all the words to it." So when I did that, I first sang the I first sang the Navy song and then went into the Air Force song because interesting enough, on my uniform, I was allowed to wear both wings, because as you and I know, we still have scars from when we used to get blood wings. I still have the scars on my chest from my Navy wings, but I had to wear my Air Force wings above it because that's your latest designator. But usually you got an interesting conversation is, "Hey, how come you're walking around with both sets of wings?" So I spent 13 years after my transition in the Air Force, retired with like a few days short of 24 years. And then went to work at U.S. Special Operations Command in Tampa at the Joint Special Ops University, where I was leading research as a senior fellow and senior faculty there. And then 2013, got recruited to go into industry, went into a small company that conducts contractor-owned, contractor-operated intel and reconnaissance, flying particularly Beechcraft series of aircraft, the King Air series 300s, and our company also modified 300s for special use, and then transitioned to a larger aerospace company, which I'm with now, called Leonardo DRS.
Sure, gotcha. So what was it like? You must have, special operations has got a big spotlight on it now. It's the big focus of the military. What was it like being a spec ops pilot? What challenges would you learn from the guys in the squadron and the guys you were using, basically your customers?
All right. So, in the early mid 90s, the joint community in special operations was getting fielded in a capacity where they can actually, it wasn't just a small niche mission set. USSOCOM was founded in '89. It has interesting authorities, both as a combatant command and as a service-like authorities. So there were some growing pains then. The special ops still was trying to figure out, and the larger service was trying to figure out how to use them. But I think early on, particularly after Desert Storm, with all the other smaller skirmishes that happened in the late 90s. I mean, I spent a lot of time in the Balkans, in Bosnia, Serbia. In that period, I spent a lot of time in counter narcotics, going to Latin America and other countries as an advisor. And there, as opposed to being a straight aviator for me, I had to join a team similar to like a special forces team. We called it an operational aviation detachment in 18. And 13-man, 14-man team, different. I was one of the guys on the team at one point, later team leader, but different skill sets. We had to really rely on each other because we were out there usually outside the wire, living on our own and conducting support operations or working with other countries. So teamwork. And if you're in a crewed aircraft, and even in the fighter world, you're still in a formation. You got to rely on the other guys. I mean, it really just reinforces that. The other thing too is that funding for specific mission sets. In the 90s and early 80s, and started in the 80s, was flying at night, owning the night, and being able to take the fight to the enemy when they're least capable of fighting back or responding. And that's where, again, tolerances for error were really low. Again, we were flying truly at zero illumination. Our exercises were, live fire, zero illumination, bad weather. You actually went out to look for that, and we'd fly in the darkest nights. And so the teamwork, crew coordination became even more of an issue, and how well, how closely we work together. But again, they were funded specifically for that. And I think, naval aviation, Marine Corps aviation also, in some cases didn't get enough funding. And we usually talk about selection and all this other stuff. Looking back, it's like, the selection and process that you go to flight school in the Marine Corps and the Navy, you can conduct these missions that the special ops guys were doing. It's just that, funding and being able to focus on that mission set was the difference.
Yeah. So, like in my squadron, we were all really close. It was kind of like, hey, look, I'll make fun of my brother, but if you make fun of my brother, I'll beat the hell out of you. But on the flip side too, we could be freaking brutal to each other.
Absolutely. I mean, we had right out, almost brawls during debriefs.
Yeah.
Where it was brutal, and rightfully so. I mean, because again, we couldn't tolerate, particularly when we were dealing with some of the most elite ground special ops teams. For them to get into those units, it's, at least 10 years of service before they get into one of those units. And when we have a time on target or somewhere where we have to insert them, a difficult place to get to, or we're on a long range exfiltration, and we tell them, our tolerances were plus or minus 30 seconds. We'll be there.
Right.
And within our own unit, we kept it even to tighter tolerances, and it was plus or minus 10 seconds that you had to be on your target, or where you're going to say you're going to be. So with that said, in any team that's high performing, there is competition, and sometimes more the brutal competition can be inside of that team.
Right.
And again, who's going to be flight lead? Who's going to? There's certain aircraft that are assigned to do certain things. In a larger formation, who's going to do that? Who's going to be, command and control? All this other stuff, which again, you compete within your team, and you have to earn that slot. So, but again, you have that pride of knowing once you've made that team, you've made a cut, and they're brothers for life.
Right. And is the leadership different from what you saw? I mean, you think about, think about organizations with little tolerance for error, probably very little tolerance for mistakes. What did you find different in that kind of high-performing organization versus a regular organization that you had?
It's interesting between rotary wing and fixed wing. Many times early on, you get too close to a tree, you get too close to you ding the blades on something. There was more tolerance to that because of the higher risk that you were taking already to get to certain places, and it was considered part of doing business. Whereas in some of the larger fixed wing aircraft, you can't afford those type of
right.
Risk taking or risk. I wouldn't say risk avoidance because it's risk management, and particularly in special ops, we don't practice risk avoidance. We do practice risk management. In fact, some of the formal risk management programs that were later used throughout the military were started and perfected inside of special ops.
So the bottom line was, hey, look, the mission was more important than if the helicopter came back a little bit damaged, but the mission was successful. We'll call that a victory. Versus a little.
And I'll tell you what, even well after 9/11,
mm-hmm.
there was friction between the aviation operators, and I won't just say Air Force Special Ops Command, but between that and the command, and when either the Ground Forces Command, the supported commanders, where they say, look, whether it's flying the aircraft, as far as overflying hours, getting waivers for certain things. There were certain targets that were worth the extra risk.
Okay, so a little bit more high performing organization, a little bit more tolerant of risk, a little bit more tolerant of negative effects, damaged aircraft, whatever, so long as the mission. So basically, it was. Do you see that in other organizations you've been in? Do you see that same mentality? How does that change kind of how?
No, I mean, again, you're not going to see that in a transport unit. You're not, in a combat unit different, but like on some of the transport, even tactical transport units, you don't see that level of risk tolerance. But again, also, when I was at the 6th Special Ops Squadron, again, Combat Aviation Advisors, the average age of my pilots when I was a squadron commander was 36 years old. So no one in that unit was a rookie. Mm-hmm. The average age in my unit was over 30, 30 years of age. None, even my enlisted folks, none were staff sergeants. We had no airmen in that unit. Everybody was already a proven expert in their background before they came to our unit. So again, you're dealing, whereas, if you're in a line unit, co-pilots that just came out of flight school are still learning the way of flying. In the Pablo squadrons, at the beginning there, when I got there, you already had to have 1,000 hours. You already had to have served in a unit, and you assessed to go in that unit. The Army Special Ops, helicopter drivers, same thing. They had a minimum number of hours. They had to have already a tactical background, and they had to try out for the unit.
Gotcha. So basically a much more high performing operation. But you got an interesting. Background. You were a couple of years ago. You were admitted to the Air Commando Hall of Fame.
Yes, sir.
You're the first aviator to be reinstated to combat status after losing a leg in a mishap.
Correct.
That took so the congratulations on the Air Commando Hall of Fame, but I think the losing a leg in a mishap, you had to learn a little bit of perseverance, and I'm sure there were personal challenges there as well. Can you talk about that?
Sure, absolutely. So in '96, I was on a counter-narcotics mission in Ecuador near the border of Colombia. We were training Ecuadorian joint forces, training them to be joint. So their version of their naval infantry or their Marines with some Navy Riverine craft and Coast Guard craft, and their Army helicopter units, which were right nearby. They had an incident where the FARC, the Revolutionary Forces of Colombia, had come across the border into the river, into the Rio Putumayo, which is the border of Colombia and Ecuador. Later, the Colombians got one of the FARC leaders in that area years later. But it was an uncontrolled space. The Ecuadorian government had asked for support at that point. We were there. I was there as part of a Joint Special Operations Task Force of Air Commandos and Navy SEALs, and the predecessors to the combatant crewmen. The special boat drivers, as we refer to them in the Navy. Their SBU, or Special Boat Unit, out of Panama at the time. We trained together. We worked up, went through Panama, and then went to this border area near Colombia. And bottom line, I'm just going to get to it. I was flying as a safety observer translator on an attack gunship helicopter, a single piloted helicopter nonetheless. But I was there to ensure that our guys wouldn't get shot, or there wouldn't be any issues with the call for fire or a close air support mission that the Army was, Ecuadorian Army was going to be providing to these riverine forces. Mm-hmm. The pilot was flying way too low after an attack run. He was concerned about FARC scouts seeing him. We were concerned about getting just too low to the ground and not being able to control the aircraft if I needed to fly it. And at the end of the day, this one mission, myself and the Navy SEAL were on board, and pilot was just flying too low, about 3 feet maybe over the water, accelerating past 150 knots. And I asked him to come up immediately. He said, okay. Next thing we knew, we hit the water. Mm-hmm. Unbeknownst to me at the time, I was ejected from the cockpit. Navy SEAL was still in the cockpit. He was able to get out after the aircraft hit the bottom. I think it was about 9-10 feet maybe, because the tail was still sticking out of the river, but the river was moving pretty quick, about 4 or 5 knots of current. Pilot died on impact. We didn't know that. And again, I was ejected. I didn't even know I was still out of the aircraft initially. I thought I was underwater starting our egress procedures. My Navy training, survival training was kicking in, trying to keep the panic at bay. I was able to make it to the surface, and I remember, calm myself down, go back under, prep myself for rescue. The Air Force had a different type of life preserver than we did in the Navy. Mm-hmm. It was more difficult to get to. I had broken ribs at the time. So I guess through the ejection, I'd pretty much severed my left leg right above the boot line at the calf. It was just attached by a calf muscle. My right knee was dislocated, and my femur was fractured at the condyles. My ankle was out at another 90 degrees, sticking out. And as I got to the surface, I looked down at it and went, oh, wow, this is going to hurt once the pain sets in. The other helicopter, Ecuadorian helicopter, a Puma, that I was going to be on earlier that day was out off on another mission. And interesting enough, a canoe. 2 natives in a canoe ended up pulling up the river, pulled me out of the river. I wasn't sure if they were FARC or good guys or bad guys. It didn't really matter at that point. I'd pretty much been bleeding out into the river. There were piranha in the canoe itself. A week before, we went through a survival training course there in the jungle, and we actually ate piranha. So luckily, I didn't think about that while I was in the river, because that probably, could have taken me over the edge. And, I kid with my wife and other folks, and I actually did, the first time I talked about it in public was at church, at my church as far as testimony. And I remember, almost thinking I was going to die in that river, and then guilt set in because my daughters were 4 and 5 at the time, and I was thinking about, hey, I could still be a good father. Good husband. I need to get back to my girls, and I kid around that what was going to become of my kids growing up without me is their dad. I said, even worse, maybe someone else is their father, and that's what the incentive to keep alive in that river. But one of the biggest things we learn about teamwork and about the story is, it wasn't just it was the amazing rescue attempt and everything else that went on from there. A SEAL team cleared this area out. A combat controller who was a former Marine recon specialist swam out to the river. The SEAL who was in the crash with me, he was able to get out. He had cervical disc injuries. He busted up his head. He was bleeding. He broke an ankle. He was still diving back into the water to pull the pilot out who had been pinned and had died on impact, but we weren't aware of it at the time. I was trying to get my HEEDS bottle, which, many listeners, if they don't know, it's a pony scuba tank that helicopter pilots carry. I was trying to paddle back, just with my hands. At one point, even picking up my boot and flipping it over to my right side, hoping that it'd be reattached, but knowing that I had the HEEDS bottle to possibly get to our Ecuadorian pilot who we thought might have been drowning. But interesting enough, I was picked up out of the river by two natives in a canoe who were poling upriver. A week prior to that, our SEALs raised the canoe for a Baptist missionary. I convinced the Ecuadorian pilots to go fly over the river. They first didn't want to because they said we didn't have the money or they didn't have the fuel to do it. And I remember having an argument with one of the pilots going, hey, if you crash in the jungle and these villagers out there are kind of stuck between your government and the FARC, wouldn't you want them to kind of, be the guys to come and get you? Because they're probably going to be first ones to come and see you, at least wherever you are in the jungle. Maybe this is a good community thing if we raise this canoe. And we found the canoe with an aircraft line over the river. It had been partially sunk, and then our Navy SEALs raised it. We were heroes. And a week later, almost to the day of that, I wasn't pulled out of the river by that particular canoe, but I was pulled out of the river by two natives who didn't, who had the good fortune that they were going to take me towards the fire base that we were at. Right. And that was implied. One of them spoke Spanish, the other one didn't. On top of that, the SEAL team, the two corpsmen that worked on me, there was an Air Force Special Ops flight surgeon there who was a member of our team who later, became my son's godfather. The team was not going to let me die. I had been pretty much almost bled out in that river. And I could see it in all their faces, as I call it, gurney vision, as I was looking up to them. And I remember this transition when the canoe got to the river's edge, or to this little camp that we were at, and the team was there. This surge of relief came over me. I'm like, all right, and it was almost like a tag, you're it. I remember grabbing the flight doc by his arm and going, Doc, his name's Joe Basinger, you got to take me home to the girls, and showing the girls. And then it was almost like this big relief. I'm like, all right, they got me. They're going to look after me. And sure enough, on the opposite end, he told me, he's like, a couple of choice expletives, as it is when we were back in the unit. He goes, man, all the pressure you put on me, now I had to make sure you were going to come back alive. And he did. He spent the next 72 hours almost, without any sleep by my side. He had to force the amputation. Because again, I was still not out of harm's way. Right. At that period. They couldn't give me any drugs. They were just pumping me full of IV fluid and antibiotics. Later that afternoon, a C-130, a Special Ops MC-130 that was in the Capitol, the pilot and the crew there basically almost crash landed it in a 2,800-foot dirt strip in the cutout in the jungle that only small airplanes were landed to. That some of the oil companies were flying their exploratory rigs out. Crews to their exploratory rigs. To the point that later I spoke to the roadmaster, who was a Vietnam era vet, and he was telling the pilot, hey, if a cow runs into the runway, just hit it, because we can't afford to hit the trees. And the SEALs literally were hacking stuff away to make it wide enough and shooing people away. There were lean-tos and goats and chickens running around. I didn't visually see that, but I was out for that. That's later I was told that. C-130 was able to back out and then take off, and they took me to the capital of Quito. I was in a hospital there for about 2 nights in the intensive care unit there. They had to finish my amputation there when they tried to save my leg, and Joe was the one who had to force them to do it because my stats were getting really bad. And then a C-141 medical airplane came out of Travis Air Force Base, met with a critical care evacuation team in Panama, flew down to Quito, Ecuador. I was on that plane later. I remember getting on the plane and seeing this big American flag, and the crew let me keep it later, but they said that flag was not only there to welcome me, but it was also there to drape my body in case I didn't survive the flight home. My wife and my mom were flown to Wilford Hall from Florida. I met them there. I spent the next almost month in the hospital at Wilford Hall in San Antonio, which is now part of BAMC, a larger trauma center. And so this was 96. Again, Bosnia was going on. We weren't in any major combat throughout the world. So, I was one of the few patients there in the hospital. There was actually a young Navy airman who had been run over by an F-14 on a carrier, and the jet jumped the chocks, and one of the main mounts went over his thigh, and he lost his leg. And we were the two, I guess amputees in the hospital at that time, getting a lot of attention from the docs.
Wow. So you were there in San Antonio for what, a month? You said a month in the hospital?
Yep. So my Pablo unit that was assigned to the commander came out and saw me. Navy Special Warfare. There's some folks in Navy Special Warfare that had lost limbs in the past. We had a couple Navy SEALs already back and operational in the mid 90s there. I got a lot of support from them. My squadron commander, my Air Force squadron commander, coin checked me. Here I'm butt naked in the hospital bed, and he coin checked me. So I said, "Hey, sir, all I got is some morphine to give you if I have to buy you a drink." But he said three things. He goes, "John, you're gonna stay on active duty. We're gonna get you a flight waiver. You're gonna fly again, and I want to get you an inter-service transfer to the Air Force." And I remember sitting there in my bed going, "You son of a bitch! How can you're right out lying to me." Because I wasn't sure if I'd ever walk normally again. In fact, I thought I was going to lose both limbs in this accident. Luckily, I got to keep one. I kind of say that was my 2-for-1 deal with the man upstairs. He gave me the grace to come home to my family, and I didn't lose both legs in the outcome.
How long was the rehab? Was that the hardest part?
Early on the rehab, and I'd say the psychological part was the early part, So for me, physical therapy, and getting into the gym was part of my emotional physical therapy. I had a lot of guilt. This pilot died at the same time. I was, just pissed off at him for trying to kill me. But again, I was home. So early on, it was that emotional turmoil about, when you're in the military and, the sacrifice you make at flight school and everything else that you want to get, it's not just a job, it's your identity. You're a pilot, you're a combat pilot, and at that point too, I was a special ops combat aviation advisor and pilot, and so you're dealing with your identity, and not only that, was I ever going to dance with my wife again? Was I ever going to be able to play with my kids, coach them, play sports? And running for me was my therapy. I'd get pissed off and I'd go for a run. So would I ever be able to do all that again? And sure enough, Navy SEAL showed up. One of the chaplains in the hospital was a former Marine aviator in Vietnam. He told me the story about a pilot that he saw in Pensacola with 2 wooden legs back in the late 60s or mid 60s when he was going through flight school there, running the obstacle course. And he put that bug in my ear about, hey, I don't know if this guy ever got back to flight status or not. But later I found out there was a Navy pilot by the name of Frank Ellis who lost both his legs in an ejection in 63. And then later tried to go back to flight status. And he landed every aircraft you can imagine on the carrier. Did all kinds of guinea pig testing. The Navy gave him a partial waiver, but he was restricted to a ferry unit, and he could, I guess, not be in command of an aircraft. He later went to Naval Postgraduate School, got his master's in engineering. He even applied for the space program, the Gemini program. And, he said his height was adjustable because back then the capsules were so small. And supposedly he made a final list in the Navy, and Navy senior leadership, whoever it was, removed him from the list because they didn't want to send a disabled guy to NASA. So he was a little disgruntled. He retired, and then I didn't find out about him indirectly through first the bug in my ear by this chaplain, and then later I was at the Naval Air Museum while I was in physical therapy, because when I went back to Florida, I was going to Corey Station right near Pensacola every day for physical therapy. Interesting enough, I went through AOCS, and my wife, when I used to kid around with my wife about, she was surprised how good my attitude was. I said, look, if I made it through Gunny Holtree, that was my,
I remember that guy.
Gunnery Sergeant Holtree, the United States Marine Corps. You had to say the whole thing. And I remember going, if I made it through him, I could get through anything. It was interesting because, you heard stories about SEER training, and man, if I made it, guys who survived, all kinds of horror stories in Vietnam. And and they go back to their SEER training, and those that went through AOCS go back to their drill instructor. And it was interesting. All that was coming back to me, and it was funny. So at that time in '96, Master Gunnery Sergeant Holtree was the chief drill instructor down at AOCS, and it just transitioned to OCS.
Okay.
So my wife went out there on her own. She said she had never been so intimidated when she walked into the battalion there with all the Marine DIs. She goes, I've been around all these special ops guys and everything, but never had been so intimidated. So she went and told the story. Hey, my husband's going through physical therapy. He keeps talking about you, Gunny, or Master Gunnery Sergeant. And so she set up this reunion. And I remember sitting in this, my wife encouraged me to get my hair cut. I was in physical therapy. My unit said, John, your job right now is to get strong again, and you're in physical therapy every day. To the point that my squadron commander, when the Navy was calling back to the Air Force unit going, hey, we need to transition him to a Navy hospital, he said, nope, he's on assignment right now, and it's classified. My assignment was going to physical therapy. And so I had cover from my Air Force unit, cover from Navy Special Warfare Command, or from particularly Dev Group and some of the SEALs that were mentoring me to get back into shape. And so that's what was going on in that period. So the biggest lesson from there was, some of the stuff that we early on endured, how that carries you through, and we call it stress inoculation. You taste a little bit of it, and if you're ever tested, you never know how, if you are going to be tested. But I had the support of my family, and I say, I tell people when I talk about this, it's faith, so it's not only just my personal faith in God, which to me was the most important part of this, but the faith in my family, the faith in my team, just the write down, when we use the word faith as opposed to just believing in something, it's unquestionable. I knew that faith that I had in my team, that they came through and brought me home. I'll never forget that. And later, later when I was in command and everything else, all the other combat missions I was in later, you never forget that, and it stays with you. And I'll just, because I'm jumping around here, interesting enough, the pilot that flew the C-130 into that jungle, Brian Downs, his family and I are connected forever. The sad part of this is Brian later was under my command in Iraq in 2005. And I lost him along with 3 other Air Force special operators and an Iraqi pilot who I consider a brother in a crash near Erbil. And, I had to inform his wife that and his kids that we lost Brian that day. And that was in one of the toughest parts of this. This was on Memorial Day in 2005. But again, all those things you learn, that's hard it's hard to describe to someone in business or, that doesn't have a military background.
Well, it's real interesting. You talk about the gunny sergeant aviation officer candidate school, and it was the one thing that you had to get in your head. The training is hard, but it'll save your life. And that's what I try to instill in some of these kids that I mentor. over at the local university is like, look, yeah, I'll ask the hard questions now, and you may think I'm a jerk, but ultimately, I'm only trying to help you. It's a little bit of tough.
Exactly.
It's a little bit of tough.
You know, exactly.
And you know, in corporate America, you almost wish people would be equally as candid. It's like, hey, look, yeah, we're gonna be hard on you, but you know, don't get offended. We're really trying to help. In a lot of ways, we're just trying to help.
Yeah, you know, and in one area you see that in is when you're dealing with venture capitalists, you know, and investors. You know, they're like, hey, you know, there's a bottom line there, and there's a reason why. You know, we're not in business just to give you a job. You know, there's an end game here. So, but you know, interesting. Master Gunnery Sergeant Holtree, later as a commander, and you know that you remember the statistics, and you know, my class, we started with 71. I think 67 actually made it that first night. You know, some people just turned around. So I think we were like 60 something candidates. And by the end of Hell Week, we were down to 21, and that same 21 graduated,
Yep.
You know, and that was, you know, I'm sure the numbers were the same, you know, similar for other classes throughout that. But, you know, 10 years later, you know, I met up with Holtree in this restaurant. He asked my wife, does he need the motivation? He said, no. She goes, but I think it'd be cool if you went out and see him, you know, and like these are super dedicated drill instructors. He still had, you know, the plaque with our coins on it. He went back and looked up my name. He still had a stack of T-shirts from all his classes. He went back to my class, brought the T-shirt out to me when I met him for lunch, a surprise thing. And I remember sitting in this restaurant with my high and tight, because my wife said, oh, you look so cute and I want you in your high and tight. But she was setting me up for this meeting with Master Gunnery Sergeant Holtree, and I could hear his voice, you know, what's this I hear about a fallen angel? You know, you get that, yep. The hairs on the back of your neck stand up, and he, you know, exchanged stories. He had done some riverine advising in Central America also. So, you know, he brought a candidate with him who was injured, who had an Achilles tendon injury. In order for me to use me as an example to this kid, he goes, here's this lieutenant who's fighting to get back on flight status, and you're worrying about this little injury you had on the obstacle course. So, you know, these guys are like machines. They never stop.
Right.
But later, you know, he had me come out and talk to the class. But more importantly, throughout my recovery, you know, it got to a point where, you know, I'll just get to it. You know, the Naval Aerospace Medical Institute, or NAMI, they got involved, and they had Frank Ellis's records.
Mm-hmm.
Who Mr. You know, I ended up getting in touch with Mr. Ellis by accident. Initially, NAMI said, this has never happened. There's no way we never had a pilot with amputation fly. And they even let me look through their microfiche records. And by chance meeting at the Naval Air Museum by a Marine aviator, said, you know, retired Marine aviator, because he saw I walked in with my prosthetic one of the days after physical therapy, and I had my Navy wings embedded in the front of my prosthetic. And he asked me what, you know, my story was. And I told him I'm trying to get back on flight status. And he goes, have you ever heard of Frankie Ellis? I said, no, sir. I was told this guy never existed. He goes, well, that's BS. We're doing a story on him right now, Naval Aviation Magazine. And so I was able to get in contact with Mr. Ellis. And on the phone, when I first told him what was going on, it was, you know, silence. And he said, son, I'm wiping tears from my eyes because I've waited for this call for 30 years. And he goes, it's BS. I got all my records. He drove him up to Pensacola from Ocala. And then the chief of the Air Medical Waiver Division there said, you know, brought me in. He goes, all right, here's the timeline, you know, that we're going to be testing you on stuff. And then, and you'll have to go through the Dunker. I was in all kinds of simulators. I was running around in the Eglin Range being chased by people, by, you know, forces to show that I can evade. And then later I was, you know, I was sent out to the USS Wasp to run around on the ship to show that I could go everywhere on a ship. I did some simulator flights, and, you know, I had to, you know, carry people out of aircraft, all this stuff. You know, it was really, it went really quickly. I remember it was in August, and I'm thinking, man, I'm not, you know, am I ready for this physically? And they videotaped me during the whole water survival refresher training. They stuck me in the very back of the Dunker while it was full. so your last ride in the aircraft dunker, while you're blindfolded, full of people in the aircraft, you'll have to get out of the same place. I remember the first round in it, I was thinking, this is easy. I was considering taking my leg off and handing it to one of the rescue divers, but I figured, better not do that. It's being videotaped. I don't want to jinx myself. During that period, Mr. Perot, Ross Perot Sr. got involved. Through one of the Navy SEALs, the Navy SEAL commander of SEAL Team 4 was deployed with one of his platoons, got in contact with Mr. Perot. Mr. Perot had this informal network of special ops folks. Mr. Perot got in touch with me and said, hey, he assumed I was going to get out. He was going to offer me a job. And I told him what I wanted to do. And he said, wow. He goes, well, he contacted Corey Station, even offered to buy equipment that the station may need to help me get back. Mr. Perot has done this for a lot of other folks, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
But eventually I got to a Navy Board of Flight Surgeons, which was similar to that movie, Men of Honor,
right,
where Cooper Gooding Jr. plays Master Chief Bashir. Interesting enough, Master Chief Bashir came to see me while I was in the hospital for my second knee surgery when I was at Portsmouth Naval Hospital, and came and talked to me. And the gentleman who makes my legs to this day, he had made Carl Bashir's legs earlier. And his talking with one of the Navy SEALs talks were like, hey, if we could still swim and jump and out of airplanes and stuff with a prosthetic, the quote was, you can get your fat ass back in a helicopter and fly. So that was the motivation I got from a Navy SEAL and from Master Chief Bashir. So, when I was back for my formal Board of Flight Surgeons after all this guinea pig stuff, where they had all the senior flight surgeons in the Navy, and the admiral there who was running NAMI, it was a formal board. They presented it to the flight surgeon college. And interesting enough, one of my, and I don't know if you remember this name, Charlie Godinez, he was another helicopter pilot, went to flight school with me. At that time was going back through NAMI in the flight surgeons course. So he was there, the brother to watch this happen, this historic event happen. And Master Gunnery Sergeant Holtree shows up in his Class A's, and the Admiral asked him, hey, Gunny, what are you doing? You're Master Guns. What are you doing here? He said, sir, I don't know if you know this, but, Lieutenant Alvarez was in my class back in 1987. And in 87. And if he made it through me, he can get through anything, and I'm here to support him. So I'm wondering if that weighed in, on the final decision there of the flight surgeons. They voted, and there was one flight surgeon who I heard was at first against it, and then later they re-voted again. It was a unanimous vote to unrestricted waiver back to flight status. So by the time all the paperwork was signed and everything, and I had my first flight back in a helicopter, it was just under a year. So I didn't lose my flight pay, and I have my little, that form you get when you're grounded in the Air Force. It's a DNIF. It's a DNIF. So I have that little form in a frame. So yeah, it was just like a week short of a year that I was grounded, and I was back on official flight status, and that was in September of 97. I went back to flying Pablos. Particularly, it stayed in a Pablo unit at that point. Went back to the Balkans for the Kosovo War. My team is the one that rescued the current Air Force Chief of Staff, the F-16 shoot down. It was our unit that also led the rescue of the stealth fighter. But it was I was in in theater, and I was our mission commander for our team that went out there. Our guys picked him up. And then after that, I went back to the 6 SOS as an assistant director of operations. We were actually at that point starting to fly the Mi-17 and other Russian aircraft to become well versed with that. And then went off to NATO, and then 9/11 happened. And then after 9/11, obviously the world changed for everybody, particularly in the military. So that I was actually in an exercise in Bulgaria when 9/11 happened. And I was able to get all our special ops guys out of there and deploy, there was a Marine recon team that basically from there went straight into theater. Also trying to get some of the Air Force special ops guys that were there out so that they can deploy. After that, I went back to Hurlburt Field. I was ops officer for the 6th Special Ops Squadron. We're standing up a qualification course for our combat aviation advisors at that period. The invasion of Iraq happened. We were involved in Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Colombia. We had, had the hostages in Colombia. Mm-hmm. I had guys worldwide, everywhere, Yemen, Philippines. That was a very, very stressful, very heavily deployed period in my life. Before that, in 98, we had another child, and I thank my special ops brothers for keeping me alive. In fact, the flight surgeon, Joe Basinger, who was with me, is my son's godfather. That was an interesting period. I guess my last, so I served another 15 years as an amputee. I was fortunate enough to be as far as we know, the first, for sure, helicopter pilot to go back to combat duty and the first pilot in the U.S. to go back to combat duty.
So
in World War II, there was a British guy who actually went back to combat.
So we got about 2-3 minutes left. What did you learn? If you're telling somebody, what did you learn through it all? Obviously, perseverance. You had a lot of support.
Well, and it's not so much what I'll tell you what, I got, after this, I don't consider this that I'm disabled. I could do just about everything I used to do before. I mean, I can't point my toes. And now as I'm getting older, I got a lot of other aches and pains and have had several surgeries and stuff, but I truly consider this a gift. I learned so much, particularly about not judging others about what their physical or mental restrictions are. One of the things I learned is, and again, Navy SEALs will tell you this when they go through BUDS, anyone who's gone through, you can tolerate and you can withstand more than you think you can. And some people say, hey, God doesn't give you the rucksack that you can't carry. You can persevere, and you come out the other end, I think, better for it. For me, I was able to see that all the training, all the things that we were, taught, that they're true. Those are truths. And, at the end of the day, for me, it was faith, that got me all through this. I mean, I'm successful in the job I'm in now. You put a lot of other things into perspective too, about, what's important in life, where people start to stress out over stuff and you go, well, there's a lot of other stuff out there that can be worse. So it helps you put things in perspective.
Oh, good. Why don't we wrap it up there? We've done a good 50 minutes. Let's wrap it up, and then let's revisit it another time, and we'll tell some more of your story. How's that sound?
Excellent. Yeah, interesting enough, my daughter also runs a podcast, but it's a fantasy podcast. She's got one that she's producing, and she's a voice actress in a couple, and she's writing a book on, and it's already in its 2nd edition. We're trying to see when, if it's going to get published, about our little, this incident, which I used to tell people it's a good Reader's Digest story. But how we're taught the term, crawl, walk, run. The name of the book is Walk, Run, Fly Again. So hopefully, maybe by next year, we'll see a publisher, and then hopefully people get to read about it.
Awesome. Hey, let's come back another time. Tell some more of your story.
Yes, sir.
Thanks, John. Thanks for being on today.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Aerospace Executive Podcast. Again, you can download these on iTunes and Podbean. They're also found on YouTube as well. Just Google Aerospace Executive Podcast. I'm Craig Pickin. Hey, if you have any questions, comments, suggestions, give me a call, 910-509-7129. or email me, Craig@NorthStarESG.com. Love to hear from you, and thank you for listening.